to you a panel discussion on Commonwealth literature. We have a very distinguished set of panelists here with us, and I'll introduce them to you first before we actually start the discussion. To my immediate left is Lakshmi Kannan. Lakshmi Kannan is a bilingual writer who writes in English and in Tamil. Her pen name is Kavari, and she has published several books of fiction, poems, and translation. She is presently a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies at Shimla. Next to her is Stephen Moss, literary editor of The Guardian. He was a judge of the 1997 Whitbread Best Novel Prize and the 1997 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. As well as writing on books, he also writes on music for The Guardian. Another judge for the 1997 Commonwealth Writers' Prize with us here today is Professor Mala Sri Lal to my immediate right. Mala Sri Lal is a professor of English at the University of Delhi, and her special area of interest is women's writing in cross-cultural perspectives. Her many publications include her book, The Law of the Threshold, Women Writers in Indian English. And next to her is Dr. Shamla Narayan, who has published books and articles on a wide variety of Indian writers in English. From 1972, she has been regularly compiling the Indian section of the annual bibliography, which appears in the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. At present, she is reader in English at Jamia Millia Islamia University. She has also been a judge of the Commonwealth Literary Prize in previous years, as has Lakshmi Kannan and also myself. So I think basically there's a kind of past and present panel of the Commonwealth Literary Prize judges sitting here. And we are going to discuss what Commonwealth literature is, what its status is today, how do we define this category, and the issue of language. Would you say then that the British novel is always somewhere else? Always somewhere else, because if either in America or Bangkok or somewhere else, I mean, would you say that, I mean, because it's so fragmented, it's so different, difficult to generalize?
I think just in the way that British society has become very, very broken, having once been rather monolithic, it's now become very personal choice is everything, consumer choice is everything. So the novel has, its concerns have also broken down, as it were. It finds it very hard to come to large conclusions. They tend to be very personal, slightly small-scale narratives, beautiful gleaming artifacts, but a refusal to take on vast subjects, and perhaps in some ways almost a fear of failure, a fear to reach out beyond their grasp, I think.
I think that would make it very different for Indian writing from Indian writing in English.
I think that's why we admire people like Rushdie,
because
who are prepared to take on these enormous subjects that go back in time and have a large canvas that use myth, and that I think that's something I don't really see any British writers doing.
But do you think that comes from societies being in crisis or something, Shamla? Would you say that? I mean, things when they're sort of on a daily basis, major crises happening, would that generate more creativity of the larger meta-narrative type?
I don't think we can really generalize. You know, talking of Indian writing in English, I feel that we should make a distinction between two types of writers. You know, there are the committed stay-at-home writers, and then there are the expatriates. So I feel, you know, the expatriates, you have Rushdie or Rohinton Mistry. I feel that they should be categorized with their own, you know, traditions. In the sense, I feel that Rushdie should go as part of British literature.
We're very happy to have him.
Yes,
we're very happy to have him.
Or I feel, you know, Rohinton Mistry, or especially Bharati Mukherjee. I believe, you know, she's part of the consciously she has become part of the American literary tradition.
But she draws on the Indian tradition all the time. I mean, so how do we make a distinction? I mean, it's all very well for her to say one thing, but then what is actually evident in her work is something quite different.
No, but there's always, you know, one has always this consciousness that she seems to feel that the real center of literature or whatever is there. While some of the other Indians writing in English, I mean, even it's got nothing to do with their origin or where they stay. You know, you take Shashi Tharoor or you take Alan Seeley, or I feel such writers, or even you know, the much hyped Arundhati Roy. I feel these writers can be put along with the writers who write in our national languages, you know, people who write in Bangla or Malayalam or Hindi or whatever. I feel there's a major group of writers, especially the stay-at-home ones. You know, I was thinking of people like, say, you know, the older generation, say Nayanthara Sehgal. In spite of her concerns, I feel that her writing is part of Indian literature. I wouldn't say the same of, say, Bharati Mukherjee or Rushdie or, you know, those sort of writers.
But you know, if we were to compare Nayanthara Sehgal and Mahashweta Devi, I mean, obviously sort of a lot of critical consensus would go in favor of Mahashweta Devi because of her other concerns and her writing and so on. Would you agree with that, Lakshmi?
Agree with see, I think consciously or unconsciously we seem to be identifying certain themes as themes that surface in what is called Commonwealth literature, like the point of view of an exiled person, an exiled consciousness,
or the view or the other side, or the view from the other side.
No, we began with that and then she also went on to the name. But it's not as if, you know, vernacular writing doesn't deal with it. There is, for instance, you know, one urban book by Professor U.R. Ananthamurthy, who's only known for Samskara. The other one is Bharatipuram, set in a town. And that deals with, you know, this kind of an oscillation between disconnecting, connecting, and just enlarging upon, wishing that India could be larger, then returning. He deals with the agony, and I think the impact is much more emotional and strong because it comes within that language. And the whole qualitative texture of this book, when it surfaces in an English translation, it could compare very interestingly, for instance, with maybe Adib Khan's Seasonal Adjustments, which won a regional award. He's a Bangladeshi writer settled in Australia who dealt with this theme. So I think somehow we are also arriving upon certain themes, we are recognizing them.
You don't think these are the themes of the past, though? That dispossession and oppression are the themes. I can see that in the 60s, when this term was coined, when countries in Africa were just becoming independent, they would have been absolutely in the forefront of people's minds, and your country would just have been less than one generation old. I don't see that in the way these themes will now start to break out. Somebody like Vikram Chandra would not deal now with these themes. They might be dimly there in the background. And what I would like to read as an outsider who knows nothing, so forgive me if this is a silly suggestion, is the great novel of sort of Indian politics that would deal with Indian political
turmoil, struggle, and everything else.
The sort of novel that sort of Anthony Trollope would have written about British politics in its sort of days of 1860s, 1870s, when it was all about backdoor deals. And is there anybody writing that sort of novel? The great novel of, because it would be a great source of, it's comedy, it's tragedy, it's drama. It's
you know, there's. I was thinking of O.V. Vijayan's The Saga of Dharmapuri. I mean, that's been translated into English. So you have a lot of this political satire and, you know, the great leader and.
No, but that even comes in Arundhati Roy's book. The political background, it's always there.
Yes.
But I don't know if anybody is writing one particular, you know, a kind of a series or even a kind of novel on that large scale of Anthony Trollope.
The themes of exile and oppression and the relationship between oppressor and the dispossessed. Clearly there are massive themes, but they're themes from the past. And I would think now the future will look slightly different, and I think you will get people like Chandra coming through who deal with, whose work comes from a completely different direction.
Quite a few of them deal with it, quite a few. And it's very amusing, you know. I think it comes with a package of either being a student of English literature or a teacher of English literature. Way back, I'm very amused when I look back on William Walsh during the 70s, was trying to define Commonwealth literature for most of us here. So if he defined it around the 70s, we got it late in the 80s. We got the virus. So he turned around, he turned around E.M. Foster's Only Connect with Only Disconnect. And he almost made it sound like a virtue. These are people who deal with its disconnection, dispossession and all that. And this is done, of course, I don't have to assure anybody that this is done in the languages, because they're all modern Indian languages and they're being done. All I'm saying is, I think since we've woken up in a very big way to the importance of translations, and we're building up thick and fast a whole body of translations, we could consider, them as a separate classification of Commonwealth writing in translation. I think the comparison would be very interesting.
But what do you think, Lakshmi, about the quality of translation and how that matters? For instance, there is a fair amount of political writing in Bangla.
Yes.
There has been a mention of Mahashweta Devi. I can add the name of Sunil Gangopadhyay, who goes back into history, but it is nonetheless looking at power structures, if that's how we understand politics. And then these books, or some of them at least, become available in translation in English. Do you think translation would help the process of disseminating the regional literatures in a positive way, or is much left to...
A good translation would. First of all, it would be read by the fellow Indians, which is a great thing in itself. The first barrier is out, and then, of course, across the shores.
I feel this is one area where Indian writing is stands apart from Commonwealth literature. I mean, using the term in its usual sense, because you turn to Canada or Australia or even the Caribbean, they don't have this huge mass of national literatures written in their own languages. It's only India which has this, what should I say, unique opportunity, or perhaps you could even call it a huge burden of, you have so much literature in its own languages and so little of it gets into English. And no Indian can possibly aspire to read much of it.
Is the problem then, would you say, is practical? It's overwhelming and it's practical.
No, and it's all the more necessary, translation.
No, because you said that there's so much literature in India, written in different languages. Is that why Indian writing in English never sort of really has that kind of status that African writing in English has? Or is it because that is more political?
No, one can't say really, because I feel it's more a question of the literature itself.
Well, Indian writing in English is very political. I mean, I have in mind, for instance, Amitabh Ghosh's The Shadow Lines, which certainly talks about a very significant episode which has touched our lives in the recent past.
No, so does Nayantara Sehgal and others like her.
Yes, Nayantara Sehgal attempted it, but I don't think she attempted a very large canvas. She tried to, in that novel called A Situation in New Delhi, she talked about the center of power, but that novel didn't have a great scope. On the other hand, when you get the great Indian novel, that's obviously a joke behind it, because no one person can write the great Indian novel.
But then that's also, I mean, highly political. I mean, presenting the whole of the freedom struggle in terms of the Mahabharata. Of course.
No, but what I meant was that in general you cannot say that the Indian novel is writing in English is as political as the African writing, because here sort of the concerns are more with middle class urban life in Indian writing. I mean, in general, I mean, you did mention exceptions, but those are not sort of really, you can't pick up so many of those. This will have to be edited out. Okay, go on, Malas. We need.
Also, I think the African question is the questions are, I mean, are unresolved. I mean, the struggle for democracy is still so much more vivid in Africa. So inevitably they're more political and more charged, I think. Here your democracy is well established.
But with the confidence, the writing will increase. I mean, here the democracy is established. There is greater confidence now. There's more writing coming up in English and in the other languages. And I think that question of language still remains, the creativity in language which we never discussed, which we just raised. And
well, one of the things we have to remember about India is the multiculturalism and the multilingualism. And no one writer, no matter how great, can really speak on behalf of another region, another culture. And the better writers delimit their area and then go into it with a certain sensitivity and understanding of the situation. So I don't think I see in the future a pan-Indian novel, which would be of a good quality. People might attempt it.
But I think every great writing has to be very strongly sort of rooted in any local situation, like we have Arundhati Roy's book, or I don't know if you consider it great. I mean, there's so many questions about that, and there are all kinds of ideas about that. But
I don't think anyone can really dispute that it is a very powerful novel, in terms of its depiction of society and the caste consciousness and the victimization of women, of course by women, not by patriarchy.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
No, we are talking about Arundhati Roy. I mean, without going into its literary merits in full, I feel that most people would agree that it is a powerful depiction of, life in that a small area in Kerala, and the way the person is discriminated.
Probably. I still feel it's a perception game.
But I have a question for Lakshmi, if that's all right, since she's been talking about translation. A novel such as Arundhati Roy's that depends so heavily for effect on the quality of English, a very innovative language, what would happen to such a book if it were translated into a language other than English for readers in India? How would that be accepted, do you think?
Something loosely defined like that. Language other than English.
Do you think it's possible to convey that same quality of writing in another language?
Like I said, I think the distinction should be simple enough. It's English and it's the other languages. It comes down to this bottom line, if I can use a crass.
No, but what she's saying is that can you capture the spirit of the language in a translation?
Of course you can, increasingly so. As I said, this is, should we call it the age of translation? I think we are moving towards that in India. You can, and we have very sensitive translations, some of them. At their best, you can. But they should be classified as literature apart from literature that gets written in English, because there are these L1 interferences, as linguisticians say. So it may not be your standard English, or it may have differences.
Well, we've had a very interesting discussion on Commonwealth literature, the question of language, and we've touched very briefly upon British literature, writing in the regional languages in India, Indian writing in English, and Canadian literature. Now let me thank our very distinguished panelists for being here with us today and sharing their views with you. I hope you enjoyed the program. Thanks.
Thank you.